Okay, hello everybody and welcome. Good evening. My name is Claire Suprin and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual convening of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University. I'm an associate professor of instruction in Jewish studies and assistant director of the Crown Family Center. Tonight, we have a panel discussion on the theme of nostalgia, longing for an imagined past. Tonight's panel is the second in a series we are calling Working Memory, the present day uses of the Jewish past. Together with last week's panel on the commemoration of Jewish history, this series is this year's Manfred H. Vogel Memorial Lecture in Judaic Studies, an event we are honored to host each academic year. The Vogel Lecture is named in memory of Manfred Vogel, a longtime faculty member at Northwestern. A scholar of modern Jewish thought, Professor Vogel educated generations of students and also helped to lay the groundwork for the robust program of teaching and research in Jewish studies that we have at Northwestern in 2021. We are grateful to Henry and Maria Vogel, who, together with their family, endowed the Vogel Lecture 8 years ago to honor their father, Manfred Vogel, who retired from Northwestern in 2004 and passed away in 2013. Today, the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies boasts over a dozen full-time faculty members conducting research and teaching courses in ancient, medieval, and modern Jewish history, in Jewish philosophy and thought, in Yiddish, Hebrew, German, and Ladino literature, in Holocaust studies, and in the study of the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. We offer undergraduates the opportunity to major or minor in Jewish studies, and we host a cluster, that's actually a technical term at the university, a cluster of graduate students from a multitude of fields and disciplines whose work intersects with Jewish studies. We also, as we are doing tonight, sponsor events for the community. It's usually a community defined as people who live in or near the Chicago area. But tonight, with thanks to Zoom, we are excited to have a community that is at least from around the country and potentially even beyond our borders. We will be hosting several other events over Zoom this spring, and I encourage you to take a look at our website to learn more about the program and more about upcoming events. I'm going to put the URL is right there in the chat if you'd like to look that up. Neither tonight's panel nor any of our other events would be possible without the support of two members of the Crown Center's administrative team, Nancy Gelman and Katie Genio, and I want to thank them. I also want to thank NUIT for their support behind the scenes, setting us up so everything should run smoothly, which is not always the case with Zoom events, so thank you. And finally, I want to note that tonight's event has closed captioning available, and you can access that if you would like to see the transcript of what's being said by clicking on the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen for closed captioning. In a moment, I will introduce tonight's moderator, but as a way of setting the stage, I want to share a very quick story that for me really gets at the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about nostalgia. It's something, a very, sort of small event in many ways, but it looms large in my mind. It happened about 15 years ago when I was a graduate student in Jewish thought. And one of my mentors, who is an accomplished and well-respected historian of Russian Jewry, had been invited to give a talk to an adult education group at a local synagogue. That's a typical enough event in the life of a Jewish studies historian or scholar, really, of any kind. But the shock, the scandal, the thing that all of the graduate students ended up talking about for weeks afterward is what happened when he went to give that talk, which is that he ended up in a screaming match with some of the students, the adult students. Why? What was the issue? My mentor, in the context of the lecture that he was giving or the material he was teaching, explained to the group that most Eastern European Jews who immigrated to the United States around the turn of the 20th century had left their homes for economic reasons, in pursuit, that is, of a chance to make a better living and have a more comfortable life. This argument is well supported by the historical evidence, but it flew in the face of the stories that many in that audience told and tell within their families. stories that focused not on economics, but on anti-Semitism, on Jewish identity. And those stories were wrapped up within those families in love and many other emotions, what we could probably call tenderness or tender emotions. Their family myths focused on American uniqueness, the United States defined as a place where their ancestors were free from persecution. Economic concerns, in contrast, seemed petty, particularly in light of the deeply spiritual lives that these American Jews assumed that their ancestors had lived in the old country. As my colleague David Shayevitz noted last week when he introduced the first panel, scholars of Jewish history have long been attuned to the overlap and sometimes the disjuncture between critical history on the one hand and collective memory on the other. That's actually a direct quote from his words. Nostalgia, I would suggest, adds yet another element to the picture. There is critical history, there is collective memory, and then there are the emotional relationships we have with the people in our families and communities who lived before us, often people we did not know, but whose stories reach us across time and space. In that California synagogue all those years ago, my mentor experienced an extreme version of what can happen when the critical study of history challenges the emotional force of nostalgia. I offer it tonight in that spirit and as a contribution to the conversation we will have about Jewish nostalgia, what it is and how we should understand it. Our moderator tonight will be my Northwestern University colleague, Dr. Charles McDonald, who is the Sava Ranisavljevic Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, with secondary appointments at the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies and in anthropology. Cam received his PhD in anthropology and historical studies at the New School for Social Research, where he continues to serve as the managing director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry. He is currently working on a book provisionally titled Return to Sepharad, Jews, Spain, and Europe's Moral Order, which is an ethnographic account of political projects that seek the return of Jews and Judaism to Spain more than 500 years after they were expelled. In addition, his article entitled Rancor, Sephardic Jews, Spanish Citizenship, and the Politics of Sentiment is forthcoming in the journal Comparative Studies in Society and History. Just to give you a quick overview, Cam will introduce each of our panelists tonight, and after their presentations, he will invite them into conversation. Toward the end of the program, around 7:45 or so, we will have time for questions from you, our audience, and I invite you to submit those questions at any point during the program using the Q&A function. You'll find the button for that at the bottom of your Zoom window. And with that, I happily hand it over to Cam.
Claire, thank you so much. So I'm delighted to introduce our first guest, Rachel. Rachel B. Gross is a religious studies scholar whose work focuses on 20th and 21st century American Jews. She's assistant professor and John and Marcia Goldman Chair in American Jewish Studies in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. Her book is just out, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, from NYU Press. So Rachel, delighted to have you, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Cam and Claire. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I'm really happy to have this opportunity for conversation with Cam and with Josh and to be here tonight. I want to begin with with one of my favorite moments from my research on American Jewish nostalgia. I'm gonna share my screen. Back in the day when we could go places, I watched visitors to the museum at Eldridge Street sit down in the pews of the beautifully restored 1887 Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side. They listened to a docent recount the history of the Grand Synagogue built by Eastern European Jews. When she finished telling the visitors about the history of this synagogue, the docent led the visitors to the back of the room and went to lead them out of the sanctuary, and she paused at the back of the room. She says, step into the indentations in the floorboards. And soon she finds that people have arranged themselves into straight lines. Slowly, they realize that they stood in the footprints of former congregants. The indentations had been made by men shuckling, rocking back and forth in front of their pew as they prayed in the traditional Jewish fashion. And this moment is so much fun to watch because some people were familiar with this motion of moving back and forth during prayer and from their own experiences in synagogue. And some are just learning how to do it and get into the spirit of the thing. But eventually they're all standing in a line in these indentations and slowly moving back and forth, emulating the motion of congregants who have not stood in these footprints for dozens of years. So over the years, these congregants left their mark in the soft pine floorboards. And standing in the footprints of these former congregants provides an immediate sensory connection to the past, one that engages visitors' entire bodies. The experience is a highlight for many tourists. One visitor wrote on Yelp, "You literally feel the history at your feet." The docent's careful orchestration of this movement helps visitors to experience a connection to past congregants physically and emotionally. In my new book, Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, just out last week, I examine the materials and institutions through which American Jews engage, promote, and teach nostalgia for turn-of-the-century Jewish immigration from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States. And I assume nobody minds that I am sharing a code for 30% off and free shipping on this book if you buy it at NYU Press. In this book, I find that nostalgia, which I define as a sentimental longing for Jewish communal origins that cannot be fulfilled, can be both an emotion and a practice. As both a feeling and a practice, it has become a prominent part of American Jewish religion since the 1970s and into the present day. I look at the case studies and materials and organizations of I look at the case studies of the materials and organizations of Jewish genealogists, historic synagogues that, I have images for that, Jewish genealogists, historic synagogues that are used as museums like the Eldridge Street Synagogue, children's books and dolls, and artisanal Jewish foodways. This is Saul's Deli near me out in the Bay Area. That's in Berkeley, California. I am happy to talk about, I'm going to mention just a few of these case studies, and I am happy to discuss any of them at greater length. But I find that all of these 4 case studies are best understood as part of American Jewish religion. And in order to make that claim, this requires us to expand our normal understanding of what counts as religious practice. So following religious studies scholar Robert Orsi, I think of religion as the practices, narratives, and emotions that create and support sacred relationships among the living, between the living and ancestors, or between humans and the divine. As religious studies scholar and my teacher, Catherine Lofton, says, religion is a way of describing the structures by which we are bound or connected to one another. I think that understanding religion as meaningful relationships and structures helps us see families, communities, and memory as central to religious activity. Understanding religion in this way demonstrates, against the arguments of worried Jewish communal leaders, that American Judaism is not in decline, but is in fact evolving and flourishing in new ways. Nostalgia is one example of these structures that bind American Jews. Although we usually think of nostalgia as a longing for our own personal experiences, it is in fact entirely possible to feel nostalgia for a time and a place that you have never experienced because you've been taught to do so by parents and teachers, through heritage tourism, or through popular culture. The tourists at the museum at Eldridge Street did not just happen to arrive at the historic synagogue and place their feet in the grooves of long ago congregants. Jewish history in the Americas dates back to the earliest years of European colonialism, but the majority of American Jews, as Claire was telling us in her beautiful and really provocative introduction, the majority of American Jews are descendants of Central and Eastern Europeans who immigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1924. Many of them settled in on New York's Lower East Side and other urban immigrant neighborhoods. In the early to mid 20th century, they began to move their families out of these crowded neighborhoods for more spacious parts of the city and suburbs. And still, they kept thinking about the old neighborhoods, and some kept coming back. Those Jews who had moved out of the Lower East Side were kind of continually replaced by new arrivals until Congress imposed immigration quotas on certain countries in 1924. Beginning in the 1970s, when many Americans began to think carefully about their ancestries, American Jews thought about their former urban ethnic neighborhoods and their European ancestries with nostalgic longing. And several new forms of American Jewish public history and popular culture followed suit. In the mid-1970s, inspired by the African American roots movement of that era, American Jewish genealogists began to organize and educate themselves. They wrote manuals and they created Jewish genealogical societies. A decade later, historians and preservationists started paying attention in earnest to the role that historic synagogues might play in Jewish public life, including the then dilapidated Eldridge Street Synagogue. In the 1990s, mainstream publishing houses started publishing an increasing number of children's books depicting Jewish immigration as part of the larger American story of multiculturalism that was so in vogue in the 1990s. And in the early 21st century, as some of you might be familiar, the Eastern European Jewish culinary revival began in earnest with the appearance of new artisanal delis and other businesses created by Jewish food entrepreneurs. So all of these kind of activities, doing Jewish genealogy, being a tourist at a historic synagogue, reading a children's book, going to a deli, these are all things that are typically thought of as leisure activities, and they can take up as much time and money as you will let them. You can do a quick search of your family history on Ancestry.com in your spare time between Zoom meetings, or you can pursue Jewish genealogy as a serious researcher over many decades. You can contribute to local, national, and international Jewish genealogical forums and databases and organizations and publications. And the fact that nostalgia might recede into the background of an American Jew's life, only to reappear in different contexts, points to its role, I think. I don't think the fact that that it might appear and reappear makes it unimportant, but in fact points to its role in structuring individual experiences into broader narratives of meaning. It places us within a broader context that helps us connect to our family histories, to our communal histories, and sometimes to our national histories. Placing individual experiences into broader narratives of meaning is, I think, the work that religion does. So all these new materials of American Jewish public history often involve thinking critically about the past and about the effect of the past on the present. They challenge us to think about who we think of as an authority on Jewish history, identity, and practice. The Jewish culinary revivalists I study, for instance, are deliberately making American Jewish food fit for the 21st century They're imagining classic Ashkenazi dishes in light of concerns about sustainability, reliance on local goods, and the slow food movement, as well as their emotional resonance. I'm going to share my screen again for just a moment to show you. This is Saul's Deli again in Berkeley, California. When Karen Edelman and Peter Levitt bought Saul's Deli in Berkeley from its founding owners, many of the restaurant's ingredients were shipped from New York to Berkeley. Participating in the Bay Area's food movement, Edelman and Levitt began to reshape their menu with local and seasonal ingredients, honoring Ashkenazi American cuisine by elevating it, in their words. But they ran into a pickle problem, as deli owners will do. They discovered that a half sour pickle is properly made from a fresh cucumber and eaten 6 to 20 days after pickling. After about 20 days, your half sour pickle will no longer be a half sour pickle. It will, in fact, be a full sour pickle. Levitt and Edelman wanted to serve pickles made from local cucumbers, which you might not know are grown between June and November. But deli customers expect a half sour pickle alongside their sandwiches all year round. Customers had to endure having half sour pickles alongside their sandwiches at Saul's only in seasonally appropriate months for some time, along with lessons in agriculture, geography, and Jewish culinary history. I love this story, but I will admit, I think it was a not a success forever. I think the owners of Saul's might have eventually given in on this one to their customers. At any rate, Edelman, one of the owners, told me, "We see ourselves in a continuum. The deli's principal story is Ashkenazi Jews from the old world and then New York, and then they continue going west," she explained, until they reach Berkeley. I love this story because it makes Berkeley and the customers at Saul's the center of Jewish history. Nostalgia places individuals and communities within an emotionally resonant story. The activities of American Jewish nostalgia for Eastern European immigration history teach Jews and other Americans how to feel Jewish by longing for particular Jewish pasts. Through a range of supposedly secular institutions and everyday materials, they take nostalgia beyond the realm of emotion and transform it into a consumable product and a religious practice. Thank you. With that, I am going to turn it over back to Cam.
Rachel, thank you so much. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Joshua Friedman is a cultural anthropologist and Jewish studies scholar with an ethnographic focus on the American Jewish community. He received his PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Michigan and is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at North Carolina State University. His work has been published in the journals American Jewish History and Cultural Dynamics, as well as in the edited book, Taking Stock, Cultures of Enumeration in Contemporary Jewish Life. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, and thanks, Cam. And I just want to take a second and thank Dr. Claire Suffren for inviting me here to be with you guys today in the Crown Center. And I'm really looking forward to thinking through this topic of nostalgia with Professor Rachel Gross and Cam McDonald tonight. And what I really want to focus on tonight is really how thinking with nostalgia might help us rethink American Jewish politics, and especially how and why different aspects of Jewish culture get pulled into political debates. And this was something that was really resonant for me about midway through my fieldwork with Yiddishists. About halfway through my dissertation fieldwork, I met with a Jewish studies academic, a mentor of mine, and she offered me her take on the contemporary politics of Yiddish. She told me, look, it's like if you're secular and you're uncomfortable with Zionism, you look around and what do you have? There's Yiddish. And I remember feeling really a little disappointed with her remarks, because you hardly needed an ethnographer to tell you that Yiddish is often essentialized as politically on the left. If you're unfamiliar with the Yiddish world, but still recognize these associations, it might be because of how Yiddish identity politics featured in political debates that were leading up to the 2016 presidential election. From articles on Bernie Sanders' Yiddish socialist upbringing to essays on the Socialist and Yiddishist Bund, the idea that Yiddish is essentially countercultural found its way into a host of news articles and opinion pieces in both Jewish and non-Jewish media alike. And I'm going to just share my screen because it also featured in public protests. Here we can see a sign, Mir wollen Sie überleben, is a sign that I saw at numerous protests in which American Jews participated. So in this way, Yiddish kind of became a symbol of resistance, a symbol of kind of the left. And so this reflects a very common sentiment about Yiddish, but I really feel like this academic's formulation really missed something crucial. By essentializing the attraction to Yiddish as a matter of one's explicit political ideology or one's religious orientation, her reflections really elided the extent to which emotion and sentiment really feature in debates about the Yiddish language. Most American Jews today understand Yiddish as a language of pathos, of humor, and especially important for our topic this evening, of nostalgia. During 18 months of ethnographic research conducted between 2010 and 2012, I met Yiddishists who identified in really a variety of ways politically and ideologically. And while I met many who highlighted their political investment in the language, what best typified the orientation of Yiddishists to Yiddish was their rejection of Yiddish's connection to nostalgia and sentimentality. Specifically, Yiddishists that I worked with described themselves as serious about the language. And they situate their own seriousness, this kind of effective orientation of being serious, as existing in a kind of fundamental opposition to the nostalgic attitudes that they identify with most what they call mainstream American Jews. So who are Yiddishists? Quite simply, Yiddishists are activists within what they often call the Yiddish world. And the Yiddish world today is not made up of neighborhoods and speakers so much as it is made up of social networks. And this is, you have here a diagram I put together. You have the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research as an example of how social networks will kind of spin off and come out of institutions. So you have Yiddish reading groups or Landkreisen, you have Yiddish peer groups, you have Yiddish classes in universities. So we're really kind of looking at a network. And some of those institutions include, as I said before, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. It includes the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. It includes festivals like CLES Canada, Yiddish classrooms in universities, and peer groups of people who are devoted to the Yiddish language. And so within this world of Yiddishism, the people who describe themselves as Yiddishists consider Yiddish culture work to be a significant, if not really a defining part of their identity. They're generally speaking, they're culture makers. They're academics, musicians, writers, organizers, and students. They differ in their level of religious observance. They differ in their connection to other kinds of Jewish communities. They differ even in whether they identify as Jewish at all. But above all, Yiddishists are serious about the language. It's that affective orientation that really kind of defines them. I'm gonna stop share here. So Yiddishists, again, they understand their own serious engagement with Yiddish as oppositional to more popular notions of Yiddish as inherently a language of nostalgic longing. So for example, when I was attending a Landkreis, a Yiddish reading group, one informant, Leonard, explained to me that his participation in my research was really contingent on my rejection of nostalgia. When I asked him whether I could audio record our sessions, he looked at me skeptically. Okay, he told me after a long pause, but only if you write something that's serious, not the normal nostalgic dissertation. There's already way too much sweetness in discussions of Yiddish. By serious here, informants like Leonard don't mean that Yiddishists lack a sense of humor or avoid registers of irreverence. Rather, they mean seriousness in the way Yiddish actor Shane Baker describes in his account of first entering the Yiddish world. Quote, "When I came into the Yiddish world, the only qualification I had was how serious are you? Are you rolling up your sleeves and joining us in the fight to save the language?" When they saw that I was earnest and speaking Yiddish, that was the only qualification they needed. Alexis, an informant who had long been active in the Yiddish world, described this value to me in an interview, this value of being serious. Quote, "As long as whatever synthesis you're making, as long as it's totally grounded in the materials that are real, that really come out of the culture, and as long as you're really serious about studying the origin and what it means in its context, as long as you really understand your fragments, you can do collage." Yiddishists have often used the trope of nostalgia to critique the American Jewish mainstream. Alan, another informant, describes how, early in his experience of learning Yiddish, he understood his relationship to the language as diametrically opposed to American Jewish nostalgia. Those engagements, he explained, were, quote, "superficial," as opposed to, quote, "really attempting to learn the real details of Yiddish language and culture." "I want to be Yiddish," he said, "and this was very good for language learning. I wanted to just absorb the culture so thoroughly that I would be native at it or near native. I wanted to speak well, naturally, with as good an accent as possible. I didn't like nostalgia Yiddish, and I didn't like English, and I didn't like exaggerated Yiddish affect for a kind of funny effect or cute effect. So I wanted to be a Bundist in Vilna in the 1930s. I asked him whether he felt being a Bundist was his only option for not being cute or funny. He clarified, "Yeah, I mean, I suppose there could have been other options. I could have been a writer for the Forward in 1910 in New York or something like that. But it wasn't like Joys of Yiddish. I think that's always the emphasis. I did buy Joys of Yiddish and I read it. I think I may have read it. I don't know if I did it on my own or there was a college class. I took it where it was recommended. So I might have bought it for that. And I read it, and some of the jokes might have been funny, but it seemed shallow and I didn't get it. So that's not what I wanted." In his efforts to become, quote, "native or near native," end quote, Alan echoes Shane Baker's sense that one is accepted into the Yiddish world by taking seriously the cultivation of Yiddish linguistic competencies and, of course, rejecting a more nostalgic orientation towards Yiddish. What Alan ruefully calls nostalgia Yiddish is the sign of the American Jew who doesn't understand the language, the sign of the American Jew whose only experience of the language is the joys of Yiddish. In my interview with Alan, he offered an account of how Yiddishists differed from those who he said didn't get it. I asked him to clarify about who didn't get it. American Jews, he told me. "Can you give me an example of someone who didn't get it?" I asked. Alan said, "I remember a guy came into YIVO." This is where Alan worked at the time. It's the Yiddish Research Institute, or the YIVO Center for Jewish Research, founded in Vilna, now in New York City. Alan was working there at the time, or had worked there in the past, as recalling a moment from his experience working in YIVO. So I remember a guy came into YIVO and he was kind of a pop star, or biographer or something, a writer basically. And he wanted to write a biography of Golda Meir. So he says, "I'm writing a biography of Golda, and I said, "Golda who?" There were lots of Goldas, and I think they're Yiddish writers named Golda, and I forget who. "Did you know who he was talking about?" I asked. I think I had an idea of who he was talking about. "Who cares about Golda? Golda? Tell me more about that," I asked. What is it? Why is it a problem that he just said Golda? Alan thought for a second. "It revealed a kind of American assumption of familiarity," he answered, growing agitated at the memory of the biographer, "and an assumption that there was one person, one kind of person, who was important, and that was the Prime Minister of Israel, and that we all loved her and admired her, and we're all on a first name basis with her. And it's just hard to explain this, but it just missed also that there were lots of Goldas. There were lots of Goldas," he said, raising his voice. "And in our archives, we had documentation on lots of Goldas. So you can't just say Golda, You have to be more specific. You have to say, what am I really looking for? What are we even looking for here? What do you want to find?" And always there was the question, can you read Yiddish? If he came in here and he said, "I want to do research on any aspect of Eastern European Jewish life in Eastern Europe or America or anywhere else, but I can't read Yiddish," it's like, well, go away, study for several years Yiddish, and come back and we'll help you. So it would be an easy to see a critique of Zionism in Allen's response to the biographer and his rejection of writing a biography about Golda Meir. But to do so misses the way that nostalgia and seriousness are really at the heart of his retort. Allen's not upset at the biographer's political orientation. In fact, he would explain to me later in our interview that how excited he was for his son to travel to Israel and learn Hebrew. His point really had little to do with Zionism at all. Rather, Allen's critique emerges from how he reframes the biographer's attempt at cultural familiarity into a contest over how exactly American Jews should engage with the past. Through Allen's eyes, the biographer's reference to Golda reveals his lack of authority to speak about the Jewish past, even though he's this hotshot biographer, because he lacks the necessary knowledge to do so. Allen's response, Golda Who, is meant to inform the biographer that his sentimental, nostalgic engagement with Jewish history makes him an outsider, signaling that though he and the biography are both Jewish, they belong to two very different kinds of Jewish worlds. So what I aim to do in my own research is to see what emerges when we center emotion and sentiment in our analyses of Jewish politics and cultural life. If Yiddishists reject belonging in American Judaism by rejecting nostalgia, it's because, as Dr. Rachel Gross has convincingly argued, quote, nostalgia has become a normative mode of American Jewish religious thought and practice. It's from nostalgia's pervasiveness in American Jewish life that seriousness gains its coherence as a way for Yiddishists to set themselves apart from an imagined Jewish mainstream. The politics of Yiddish, I would thus contend, are not structured first and foremost by political ideology or religious orientation, but rather how it's situated in relationship to nostalgia itself. Thank you.
Joshua, thanks so much. So let me just, I want to say a couple things, and then I actually would just love to dive right into a few questions with the two of you. Then after that, we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. So something I think that's really important and useful about the sort of interventions that you're both making is foregrounding emotion and sentiment. And you both said this in different ways in your pieces, but I think often that gets overlooked, right? And by focusing on emotion or focusing on sentiment, you're both expanding sort of the what counts as a sort of a suitable site, right? A suitable object of inquiry for Jewish studies, but also showing the ways in which the people that you're working with themselves are thinking more expansively about Jewishness, about sort of a religious or a cultural identity that isn't quite as nearly as neatly bifurcated, sometimes is claimed. Something that Rachel, I think, got at as well. So I really appreciate the way that you're both, I think, coming from quite different angles and allowing us to see I think resonance is a word also that Rachel used, the kind of resonance that affect has. And in Josh, in your case, right, there's a sort of this anti-nostalgic posture that I think also tells us a lot about some of the ways in which contemporary American Jewry is changing or shifting. So why don't I actually go, Rachel, to you first. And I want to actually ask about that distinction. I think if I understood correctly, I mean, you say this a bit in the talk, but I think it's also in your book, that part of what you're pushing up against by highlighting nostalgia and taking it seriously is perhaps scholars who've been too quick to make this sort of neat division, right, between what is Jewish culture and what is Jewish religion. So I wonder if you could tell me a bit about how nostalgia emerged for you in this work, how it became clear to you that this was an important site or important way to think about American Jewishness today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cam, for that question and for your generous read of our talk. I'm so excited to dive in and ask Josh questions as well. But I will. I tell two origin stories of how I came to write this book, which I'm very excited to say is an object in my life that exists now. And these are two quick stories. One is that I've been working on this for a very long time. It was my dissertation. And I started this work, or I started thinking along these lines, I think, as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, where my professor, Vanessa Oakes, told a bunch of undergrads that she was an anthropologist of American Jews. She's a religious studies scholar, and I think she might identify in different ways with different audiences. And unlike the two of you, I am not trained as an anthropologist. Like Professor Oakes, I am trained as a religious studies scholar, but I heard that phrase and I thought that was the coolest thing, that you could study ordinary Jews doing ordinary things, and wanted to grow up to be that. And my other origin story is that I wrote my master's thesis on historic synagogues that were used as museums, and that eventually, long way later, became one chapter of this book. And when I started thinking about historic synagogues that were used as museums, I was interested in ordinary Jews and what those ordinary Jews might be doing. And one thing they were doing was going to historic synagogues, some of them. And I was really interested in these spaces that were both synagogues and museums, right? Supposedly one is religious and one is cultural. And what does it mean for a space to be both, or to alternate between one, or to go from one to the other? So I was really interested in that tension. And I find ultimately that maybe that tension isn't so useful. Maybe the division, I would argue that the division between religion and culture, sometimes between museum and synagogue, are overdrawn. And the other thing that this led me to was to think about what were people doing in these spaces? They were feeling something. And that's where I started thinking really about nostalgia. What did that emotion that people felt in these spaces? What work was that doing? Who was it connecting them to? What larger stories was it connecting them to?
I don't know, Josh, if you want to maybe answer some of the same question about how nostalgia emerged for you in your field work. I don't know if maybe that's also when you revisited that, as you were writing, but I'd love to know a little bit about how that emerged for you as well.
Yeah, I think I really started with emotion writ large, like thinking first about emotion and sentiment writ large. And as I say in the talk, it's really, in my work, nostalgia is definitely a subsection of this larger interest in emotion that kind of came up for me. I mean, it's really impossible to study Yiddish in the American Jewish context without running into nostalgia. Both, if you're working with Yiddish, just if you're working with really like devotees, like Yiddish activists, who are constantly positioning themselves and forced to position themselves against these language ideologies, these ideas about Yiddish is essentially nostalgic, where, a professor of mine says, look, if I ever want to get a laugh during a talk, I just say something in Yiddish and I get a laugh. Even if people don't understand, it's like this connection, this ideology about Yiddish connected to humor. When I was I did some research at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. People who were not Yiddish speakers would come and cry at the sight of Yiddish books. So I think getting it to what Rachel is saying, the thing that people are doing is they're feeling something. But so even when I first started doing preliminary research, one of the first conversations I had was with a Yiddish instructor who was, really upset at the Yiddish Book Center that she felt had this overly nostalgic attitude, and connected nostalgia to ideas about consumerism and these kinds of, if you read Dr. Gross's book, right, you'll see that this kind of the ways in which nostalgia is normally talked about, right, as a kind of a modality which mitigates against critical thinking and reflective thinking. And people were really upset, and they were upset for they're actually upset for really good reasons in the field, because the person who really writes really eloquently about this is Rachel Kafferson, across different forums. But Kafferson has pointed out that one of the things that happens when nostalgia becomes the only qualification for being an authority figure when it comes to Yiddish is lots of people who don't really speak the language, understand the language, are able to really kind of publish, make money, become famous, get invited to talks, and other people who are really devotees, who've really invested themselves in the work of, like Alan, right, of really wanting to speak with as good an accent as possible to really know the history, who are not able to get that work in the same way. So there's really a political economy of emotion that kind of becomes visible to us as scholars and this is what I love about Rachel's book, right, is that if you can really pay attention to what normal American Jews are doing on an everyday basis, right? Lots of different, very interesting things about the structure of American Jewish life become visible. And in my work, it was really the political economy of nostalgia that kind of came out.
So it seems like it's also a question of, not just the perennial question, right, of who is a Jew, but also about who sort of owns Jewish culture, right? It's not just about authenticity, but about, as you said, that certain people are able to accrue wealth or prestige or all these other things through the vehicle of Yiddishness, right? Which I think offers an interesting vantage onto this. It's a little bit different. A question I had for you, Rachel, was about the way that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's a kind of, it seems like you're more or less in step with or agree with the claims that some of the folks, for example, at the synagogue/museum are making about the power of, for example, being able to put one's feet, right, in a place that a kind of ancestor, right, or a kind of kin has been. Do you think so whether it's there or in this broader field that your book is looking at with food, consumer items and toys, do you see any sort of is there a sort of maybe a dark side or a danger to nostalgia? Is there a risk that we run in accepting that too readily?
Absolutely. I really appreciate that question. And before I answer it directly, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the people I'm speaking to, just like the people Josh speaks to, are, I think, careful researchers and experts in their field, and don't consider themselves nostalgic. And I think that I would love to hear more from Josh about that. I think of myself as looking at a range of people, some of whom are experts in a thing, and some of whom might dabble in it. And I think it's really important to think about that range, that it's not the kind of binary that some of the folks Josh talks to want to imagine it is for important and I think reasonable reasons. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the people that I'm speaking to, many of the experts that I'm speaking to, would not call themselves nostalgic. And that's my word. And when I'm using it for certain theoretical reasons. And I think Josh really demonstrates how people disparage nostalgia. That's to say that something is nostalgic means that it's no good, it's ignorant. And I think by thinking carefully about the work that nostalgia does, it helps us think about the importance of emotion. And I wanted to answer Cam's question, but I also wonder if Josh wanted to jump in there. I saw you nodding along.
Yeah, there's so much to say. I want to hear more about, you made this point about in your talk about expertise, right? And I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had about categories of practice and categories of analysis here. Because in my talk, people are using nostalgia as a category of practice, right? Some of them are scholars. So they're speaking to me in their persona as an informant, right? But is Alan not being nostalgic for wanting to be a Bundist in the 1930s or a Yiddish journalist in 1910? He would say no. Somebody else might say yes. But I think at least in my research, what it pivots on, I'd argue, is a certain idea about materiality, actually, the materiality of nostalgia. And I'm really anxious to hear what Rachel has to say about materiality, because I know it's a big part of your work. But notice that in my final vignette of the so many Goldas, like he doesn't explicitly use the language of nostalgia in that vignette, but he's using an idea about materiality, which is that nostalgia is thin. It's it's superficial, it's on the surface, as opposed to his orientation, which is deep, rooted, grounded. It's the product of a lot of labor, right? And so what makes something nostalgic or not nostalgic, I think, is people's perceptions of the materiality of what they're talking about, right? And those ideologies, of course, can be redeployed even among Yiddishists, right? So there are people who thought that they were serious and other people talked about them as nostalgic and use similar ideas about, well, what they're doing is really superficial or it doesn't really get at the depth of what's really going on. So, I think that there's a really interesting conversation to be had about, how exactly do we differentiate? If we're using nostalgia as a category of analysis, how do we make distinctions among people who are being nostalgic, even when they're saying that I'm not being nostalgic, and this is why my orientation is not nostalgic.
I just want to jump and say something quickly, and then maybe Rachel can respond to that. But it's interesting that distinction of the nostalgic is that which doesn't entail enough labor, right? And the cases that you're exploring, Rachel, are about this tremendous labor that goes into the production of nostalgia, right? So what do you, if you want to follow up on Joss's question about materiality, and then maybe I'll ask one other question, we'll open it up to people.
Absolutely. I think to respond to Josh, and I think to respond to your earlier question about the dangers of nostalgia, I think Josh is right, and that a lot of people think about nostalgia as dangerous sometimes, in that it's thought of as a prefabricated emotion. It's a ready-made emotion. You can buy it and you can consume it, and that's easy. And I think that the people that I'm looking at, whether they're people who spend their lives studying their genealogies or people who just go on Ancestry.com really quickly, I think the work of nostalgia can connect you to a deeper and larger narrative that can stretch across your entire life. I think of nostalgia as placing a longing for the past that places an individual within a larger story. And sometimes the work of placing yourself in that story is the work of a lifetime, and maybe in a kind of really broad way, right? If you're somebody who goes to who experiences your Jewish identity by going to a deli, maybe telling a family story once, right? That's a lifetime of experience of nostalgia that I think can be really deep, even though if we think about only one of those activities in isolation, it can seem superficial. Another,
or I'm thinking, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say another, the obvious danger of nostalgia is that it's a normative story. And what I think of myself as doing in this book is telling one of the big stories that American Jews tell about themselves. And that is a story, and I think Josh is doing this work as well, and I think we're partners in this work, is, I hope you would agree with this, that we're telling the way Jews tell a big story about the majority of American Jews, the majority of whose families came to the United States around the turn of the century from Eastern Europe. And I think of myself as naming that big thing. Nostalgia is a norm, and it pulls other people into that story. Even if you're a Sephardi Jew, if you're a Mizrahi Jew, it's impossible to escape the patterns of American Jewish nostalgia. You get pulled into them in different ways. And I think of this work as naming something that's out there and hopefully opening up room for other people to tell other stories. We have to name the big story that's going on before we can name, or it'll help us name other stories.
Yeah, can I follow up on that? I think this is really one of the values of Rachel's work in my own work, right? And how she's thinking about nostalgia, because naming nostalgia it's the normative nature of nostalgia which gives Yiddish its coherence, right? the politics of Yiddish and the politics of Yiddish seriousness, in particular coherence. It's what links it to these ideas about political economy that people map onto what they think is nostalgia versus what they think is serious. So one of the things that I loved about that scholarship is it really just, frankly, it did a lot of really hard work that then I did not have to do, but then could just cite Rachel, who had done the heavy lifting. But I'm working from the edges of mainstream American Jewish life and trying to tell a story about the mainstream from the edges. And part of that story for Yiddishists is the extent to which, and this is actually kind of a potent politics that Yiddishists wield, is part of that story is that no, it's American Jew. Everybody says that Yiddish is the thing that's nostalgic and this thing that's overly sentimental, but it's actually American Jews who are nostalgic and sentimental. And I think that they are wielding that narrative both as a way of allowing themselves a certain kind of authority, right? And also because they recognize as a kind of social fact that nostalgia is the normative mode of American Jewish engagement. And that's where the politics emerge from. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the really great things about this new work from Rachel Gross, for sure.
Thank you.
Great. So one last thing I wanted to ask, and maybe we don't have to respond to it now. We can take a few questions and then return to it. But in my own work on Sephardi Jews and return to Judaism in Spain, nostalgia also, unsurprisingly, looms large, right? It figures importantly. And something I was thinking about listening to both is the sort of the gap there, right? So there's theoretically, right, the past that's the object of inquiry or desire for the people with whom you worked is somewhat closer, right? It's the late 19th century, it's the early 20th century, or it's these objects that are associated with that. So perhaps after a few questions, we could return to thinking about what happens when that nostalgic object or that time or that place, right, is much further away, right? It's like 5 centuries away, for example. But why don't we switch to Claire? And I think you're gonna read us a few of the questions.
Yes, I am. And thank you. This has been already so fascinating. So thank you, everyone in our audience. We've got already so far 15 questions that have come in, which is really exciting. I'm going to try to, rather than asking, reading individual questions, I'm going to try to draw together some of the themes that I see. And I think maybe 3. I'll sort of throw 3 questions at you guys, and we'll see what sticks. So feel free to respond after I've said the 3 to whatever is most interesting to you. A number of people are really sort of interested in thinking about the future, right? When your sense of meaning or the narrative of meaning or the narrative in which you find meaning is from the past, what do you pass on to your children or to next generations? How are you building toward a future? Are you building toward a future? So that's one question. A couple of people have asked as well, if we were to flip back 50 years in time, let's go pre-internet, pre-turn of the century, go a generation or 2 earlier, what was the equivalent of nostalgia? Or what was the equivalent of what these Yiddishists today, or the mainstream Yiddishists are doing? What was the non-synagogue, let's call it that, religious activity? Rachel, if I can kind of morph your terms a little bit. And then for a third question, people are really interested in even more crossover between your talks. So Rachel, how does Yiddish fit into your work? And then Josh, what about the Yiddishists, the serious Yiddishists, who are also mainstream Jews, who belong to a synagogue, let's say, or who also engage in the eating of deli and the gifting of Jewish books about immigration to their neighbors and their nieces? I will stop there and let you guys take it where you would like.
Josh, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
I'd love for you to get us started. it's a lot
There's
to
a
bite
lot.
off there. Yeah.
There's a lot there. I'm going to start actually with Claire's Claire's question to you about mainstream Jews, because I want to clarify that I think of my study as I looked at people who would identify across religious spectrums. So I'm looking at people who are involved in Orthodox synagogues and every other kind of synagogue, and people who don't identify with any formal Jewish religious structure. And I think of nostalgia as something that happens across the board for these folks. So I'm wondering about your study as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be really careful in how we talk about identity here. Really, I mean, there are certainly Yiddishists who have a Yiddishist identity. But I think Yiddishism, I like to think about first as a practice, right? In the same way that I'm sure that you would talk about nostalgia as a practice. And so at certain moments, people are, the same person who's disparaging, Alan, who's disparaging this biographer who's going to write about Golda, is going to send his son on probably like a normal American Jewish trip to Israel and to learn Hebrew somewhere, right? So people are complicated and full of contradictions, and it's not like there are just a set number of just Yiddishists over here, and then you have who are all left wing or all radical, and then they're normal mainstream American Jews. These are ideologies that people map on to different phenomena and institutions and kinds of people in their lives, but the real lives of people always complicate those ideological constructions.
I think yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I was done.
I was just going to say that sounds exactly right. And I really appreciated your articulation of that. And I think that thinking about Claire's question about the place of Yiddish in my work also complicates the kind of neat boundaries that we create as scholars. And in part because I knew that there were other wonderful people working on studying Yiddish like you. I knew that I didn't need to do that work because you were doing it. So I'm looking at case studies I think of my case studies as case studies of material culture and of certain kinds of institutions. I know you're also thinking about institutions, but I'm thinking about material. I started by thinking about material culture. I started by thinking about generally stuff that could be bought or sold. In the case of Jewish genealogists, they're thinking about family heirlooms, and they're creating products like Jewish genealogy guides, how-to books, and family history books. So I started by thinking about the material culture. And of course, Yiddish is all over the material culture of nostalgia, probably mostly in the kind of schmaltzy way that your serious Yiddishists, so to speak, would hate. But it is all over the place. And I absolutely benefit from your work and from other folks' work in how Yiddish operates in the materials of American Jewish nostalgia.
Yeah, this may be getting a little bit too inside baseball, but as somebody who's read both the dissertation and the book, I'm curious about the materiality and the material culture. Can you talk maybe a little bit about how the place of materiality and material culture changed from moving from your initial research on American Jewish nostalgia to actually the place that it holds in the current book manuscript?
Yeah, I started by thinking about things, and I ended up by thinking about institutions. So I think that the folks that I look at are all kind of creating various types of institutions that are not the ways we normally think about American Jews and institutions. When we normally think about American Jews and institutions, we think about synagogues, we think about JCCs, and we think about federations. I think those are about the big three. And I think that there are actually a lot of other ways Jewish communal organizations, some of which, like the Yiddish Book Center, don't count among those big three. And these are actually the ways that Jews organize themselves through Jewish genealogical societies, through historic synagogues, through children's books. And if I can incorporate the question about the future here too. So Jews are using these objects, they're building these institutions, and I think all of these things are directing values about, through which they're articulating values that they think are important for their communities in the present, things that connect them to the past, and that they want to explicitly, things that they want to pass on to their children. And I'm curious how that works in your work, but I'll say I think about that most explicitly, probably predictably, in my chapter on children's books, because that's explicitly where folks are really, like, very explicitly saying, these are the values and these are the stories we want our children to inherit.
Yeah, so the minute you started talking about the ways that materials create institutions, I thought about the Yiddish Book Center, where I did a good amount of my field work. And that's a really great example of an institution that is very much literally created by the sheer material weight and scale of what they were collecting. Aaron Lansky set out to collect or basically save the world's Yiddish books. And in the you have to store them somewhere. Where are you going to store what turns out to be, thousands, hundreds of thousands of copies of Yiddish books? They stored them in an old mill building in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which itself was in the middle of its own kind of, revitalization, in which it was kind of drawing on its own nostalgia and trying to gentrify downtown Holyoke. So it was stored in this mill building. And then, in one interview, I remember sitting down with Aaron Lansky, and he tells me this story about how driving to Holyoke once, he saw a fire burning in the distance. And because of the kind of economic decay that had happened in Holyoke, kind of with a post-industrial, post-Fordist kind of shift in Holyoke. It was known as Arson's Fire City, or Arson City at one time. It used to be Paper City. And so people were setting fires to mill buildings to collect insurance money. It was something that was really kind of going on. So he was really worried, oh my God, is this like our building that's actually all of Yiddish literature? This is before digitization. And of course it was not, thank God. But there's a way in which certainly the materiality of, in this particular case, Yiddish, demanded certain kinds of institutional formulations and creations. And it was really closely connected to philanthropy and to the intimate lives of so many different Jewish families and eventually family foundations. And the future, by the way, is all over this, right? Because the process of collection itself kind of harkens to some kind of future that will conjure at some point. And then so
it's always like this anticipatory movement.
Exactly. Yeah. It's this kind of, and I think the production of, if we're thinking about centering emotion, the production of anticipation is a big part of what this institution was creating. The feeling of anticipation, of being on the precipice of being able to save and revive this kind of Yiddish literature, the creation of like a potentiality. And so it's interesting to think about I'd love, Rachel, to know, as you're thinking about materials and the creation of institution, how this might tie into some stuff about philanthropy, which I know you've written and talked about, how it ties into funding these institutions. It's kind of how these things are connected: sentiment, institutions, materials, and money.
Yeah. None of these things can happen without money, of course. And I know we're all thinking about Lila Corin Berman's new book out on philanthropy. Yeah. I think about philanthropy in terms of how it funds historic synagogues. I know there was a question about pre-internet days. I think, although my work is really heavily focused on the present, I think of my case studies actually starting in the 1970s. Jewish genealogists got their start in the 70s, and I think we're on parallel chronologies here. And then historic synagogues really took off in the 1990s and had to get a lot of buy-in from philanthropists in order to fund renovations for synagogues. And I think about philanthropists maybe even more carefully when I get to the 1990s and children's books, because the children's books that I'm thinking about, all of the children's books that I analyze in my book, are distributed by PJ Library, which is a major philanthropic organization of American Jews. I would argue, nobody else argues this, but I think that they are like the most important American Jewish organization, because they're an organization that partners with local Jewish organizations to distribute free children's books about Jews and also music to Jewish and interfaith families. So this is a philanthropic effort to get to your children's bedtime, right? It's the PJ Library for a pajama, and they want to get at that most emotional, most tender moment and teach your children and your family something. It sounds a little creepy when I put it that way, but like, look, they do lovely work. This isn't an anti-PJ Library comment, but like this is a philanthropic effort to get you where you're vulnerable and to try to change the way you're thinking about American Jews.
It's worth saying that
do you want to?
So, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Should we maybe jump to a few more questions, then we can return to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds great. The questions are flying in, and I'm going to try to be somewhat fair to all of them by grouping them together. So one thing that's really emerging in the questions is, to what extent are you observing a specifically American phenomenon, right? It's just the Jewish expression of something American. So that's one question. And then I'm curious, and I think this is especially for Rachel, although watching the two of you go back and forth is really the most exciting part tonight, is when you have expanded your definition of religion in sort of the Orsi model, and Orsi, of course, is my colleague here at Northwestern, so that things that wouldn't otherwise appear religious are now sort of in this same category. How does that change the way that you think about the more typically religious spaces and practices and things like that? How does bringing the Jewish deli into the range of American Jewish religion change how we think about the synagogue, or keeping kosher, or lighting Sabbath candles, things like that? And even if this is now coming from me, like, how do you teach Intro to Judaism, having done this kind of research?
Josh, did you want to?
I'm gonna let you take this one.
Well, I'll answer the one about religion, and then we'll go back to, wait, now I've already forgotten the first question.
America. To what extent are we observing American phenomenons in their Jewish version, but something about America?
Great. I'll answer the religion question quickly, and then we'll talk about America. Perfect. Dispatch religion quickly. I think that when we think really broadly about religion, it doesn't mean that the traditional stuff we're thinking about it doesn't mean synagogues don't matter, right? But it does mean that if you're worried about synagogue numbers going down and saying this is the only thing that is happening in American Judaism is in decline, well, maybe you got to broaden that, right? American Jews find meaning in lots of different ways. Historically, they have found meaning in many different ways. And when you're worried about that decline of religion, you're really starting from the peak of the 1950s, which was the peak of synagogue attendance for everyone. And when I teach Intro to Judaism, I will admit that when the department chair who hired me here gave me the task of teaching Intro to Judaism, he said, Rachel, could you just teach, you know what we mean when we say religion? Could you just teach religion the way the rest of us mean it? And I said, not really. I will say with Intro to Judaism, I absolutely love my San Francisco colleague, Judaisms by by Aaron Huntapper. Thank you. As I'm like at the end of this talk, I'm totally blanking. Thank you. Aaron Huntapper's in Judaisms thinks about what's meaningful to Jews in power. And I think he also, while he might not use the language of speaking about religion really broadly, he does think about all the ways that Jews form communities and make meaning in their lives. That's how I teach Intro to Judaism. Josh, do you think there's something special about America here?
I think that, I briefly did a little research in Vilna, Lithuania, and there was a collection project done by an American expat that got funding from the Lithuanian government, and everybody there recognized it as an American model that was that the Lithuanian government was basically using that somebody who I interviewed, who was involved in the project, who at the time was very connected to Lithuanian politicians, explicitly said, we're trying to raise money from wealthy Jews Lithuanian Jews who emigrated to South Africa. And they had really used Lansky's model, which is, it's very American. It's extremely entrepreneurial. It's definitely this kind of like third generation remembers what the second generation wants to forget kind of narrative that is so popularly a part of how American Jews understand ethnicity and immigrant trajectories. So I think in those respects, at least my research, specifically the work that I did on the Yiddish Book Center, was explicitly American, recognized as American, drew on common American tropes of entrepreneurialism and success in business. I think it was deeply American. As far as how it changes my approach to, there's a pedagogical question there too, which is probably not exactly what you were getting at, but that's kind of like you gotta crawl before you can walk. So I don't know if that would change how I taught Intro to Judaism. It may change how I would teach upper level classes. Maybe Intro to Judaism would be Judaism, and then it would be Judaisms, would be the Judaism 354 or whatever it would end up being. So that's kind of how I would respond to the question about how I would teach it.
I think it's part and parcel, but that might be a difference between our syllabi.
Do we have another hour and a half? We can talk about we can talk about pedagogy.
So I will jump in with one more question, and then I think we will draw it to a close. And that is, in addition to nostalgia, what are the other emotions that you see at work in your field work? Is nostalgia this umbrella term, in which case it incorporates a lot of other identifiable, distinct emotions, or are there emotions in addition to nostalgia?
I think of nostalgia, predictably, because I wrote a book on nostalgia, I think of nostalgia as an umbrella term. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in this book is nuance nostalgia. So in a number of different ways, but one is by thinking about different registers of nostalgia. So when I think about historic synagogues used as museums, I think that they're really showing or teaching to visitors an elegiac nostalgia, longing that's really based on elegy and a certain type of longing for the past. When I talk about children's books, it's a really intimate nostalgia, right? Because it's the moment that you're reading to a child and you're getting right up there and personal in children's stories. There's a real intimacy there that you might not find in a grand historic synagogue. And when I'm talking about the new types of foodways, I think there's a real playfulness in a lot of the artisanal delis that I'm looking at. And there's sometimes even some irony, right? There's a lot of self-consciousness in selling if you're a person who's selling a corned beef sandwich made from artisanal, sustainable beef, whatever, like a lot of these folks can both take themselves seriously and do it a little tongue in cheek, and can give their sandwiches all kinds of funny and playful names, and are doing it with a lot of self-consciousness. Josh, do you see other emotions?
Yeah, so the paper or the article that this talk comes out of, I unfortunately don't have a beautiful object that it's bound in, but it's a paper called Serious Jews: Cultural Intimacy and the Politics of Yiddish, published in Cultural Dynamics in 2020. And nostalgia is really connected to feelings of embarrassment feelings of shame over, Laura Levitt writes about the shame of not being a good enough Jew, right? Not knowing enough. So there's jealousy, anger, right? That all is kind of bound up. And I think ultimately this concept, which we probably don't have enough time to totally unpack, this concept of cultural intimacy that comes out of Michael Herzfeld, anthropologist Michael Herzfeld's work, which is all about the ways in which we recognize who we're connected to, what our identities are, from the feelings of embarrassment that we have over aspects of our identity, when those the kinds of things that might become public. So if you're thinking it, so the aspect of cultural intimacy from American Jews is not actually being Jewish enough, right? And so American Jews will joke among themselves about how they're not really Jewish enough. And one of my favorite quotes from one of my informants that I use in this paper is, he says, he's not Jewish, he's an incredible Yiddishist, and people always ask him, do you want to convert? And he says, no, that's okay, I already have a religion I'm not very good at. Which is an amazing line, because he insinuates, and this is like, I think, perfect, now that there's so much data that I have that like I want to kind of give to Rachel, because it's like really fits her, the framework that she's using. But he knows that part of what makes American Jews really American Jewish is that they're not that good at the religious part of being Jewish, right? They don't know a lot about the things that they're expected to know a lot about, right? And so he's able to, even though he's not Jewish, he's able to claim an insider authenticity based on this feeling of kind of collective embarrassment and shame about, not knowing what you think you should know in order to be a good Jew or a good American Jew. So there's a whole kind of constellation of emotions. And I think this is one of the reasons that I love Rachel's book, is because it's just, and that I love your work as well, Cam, but just what happens when we think about sentiment first, right? When we think about emotion first, it really can illuminate so many things that get glossed over. And we didn't even talk about the gendered aspects of why those things get glossed over, which is, we need another 3 hours to talk about that. But yeah, there's a whole constellation of emotions that come up.
Okay, I am going to jump in, and I want to formally thank Rachel and Joshua and Cam. Thank you for moderating so well, and really leading our panelists through such a great discussion. I feel like so much was said, and exactly, Josh, as you were saying, there's so much more we could continue to talk about. I want to thank everyone who has stuck with us until the end. I hope you leave with a lot of feelings to process, a lot to think about, and please check our website for upcoming programs this spring. We've got some food programming to connect back to all of our talk of delis and some other things as well. So take care, everyone. Be well and have a good night. Thank you.